I think as we've started to see the kind of outpouring of remembrances of memorialization, it is filled with Martin Luther King, with John Lewis, with A. Philip Randolph, with Bayard Rustin. They are who dominate our public remembrances. Few will remember that Coretta Scott King, in the aftermath of the Birmingham campaign in 1963, urged Martin to call a massive march on Washington to dramatize the need for legislation. Coretta Scott King had been a leader for racial, global, and economic justice for years before 1963 and would continue after. What then would it mean to center her, to spend our time tonight focusing not on the men on the dais, but on Coretta Scott King? Now, many of us tonight have talked about the ways that women were marginalized at the March on Washington. The wives of civil rights leaders, including Coretta Scott King, did not get to march with their husbands. No woman spoke at the March on Washington. Daisy Bates gave a short introduction to a tribute to women that was written for her by John Marcel of the NAACP, and some women, including Rosa Parks, were asked to stand and be recognized. After the March on Washington, 10 civil rights leaders went to the White House to meet with President Kennedy. None of them were women. Coretta Scott King was not pleased by the treatment of women both at the march. She also was not pleased that no women got to go to the White House. In fact, in 1966, in an interview, she said, "Not enough attention has been focused on the roles played by women in the struggle. Women have been the backbone of the whole civil rights movement. Women have been the ones who have made it possible for the movement to be a mass movement." So part of centering our time tonight on Coretta Scott King is to see the gender inequality in the movement in our public memory. But sometimes I think when we see the gender inequality, it becomes a blinder to seeing these women themselves and the crucial intellectual, organizing, and leadership roles they were playing. During her life, Coretta Scott King often lamented how she was seen but not heard. "I am made to sound like an attachment to a vacuum cleaner, the wife of Martin, the widow of Martin, all of which I'm proud to be. But I was never just a wife nor a widow. I was always more than a label." So politically engaged and probably more of an activist than Martin when they met, Coretta Scott had grown up poor in Alabama. She had received a scholarship to go to Antioch College in Ohio. She majored in music and elementary education. She became politically active at Antioch, partly because while she was majoring in education, the town of Antioch did not let Black people student teach, so she was denied that opportunity. In 1948, she is one of only 150 Black people to attend the Progressive Party convention. In 1948, people may remember there's a third-party challenge by Henry Wallace against Truman and Dewey, and a very young Coretta Scott is there at that convention listening to Shirley Graham Du Bois. And then later, at a Progressive Party meeting in Cleveland, she met and sang for Paul Robeson, who was her hero and who in many ways she wanted to become. Now, she goes to the New England Conservatory of Music, and through a friend in 1952, she meets young Martin Luther King, who was in Boston getting his PhD. From that very first meeting, her influence on him was significant. He writes, "I will never forget our first discussion about the question of racial and economic justice and the question of peace. She had been actively dealing and engaged in these movements and dealing with these problems." He would later explain, "I had to have a wife who would be as dedicated as I was. I wish I could say that I led her down this path, but I must say we went down it together." So very much from the beginning of their romance, from the beginning of their partnership, was a commitment to kind of global human rights, to civil rights, to anti-colonialism. 2 weeks before the March on Washington, they had their first baby, about 8 weeks after the Montgomery bus boycott, their house is bombed. And Coretta and baby Yolanda, who is by that point 8 weeks old, are in the house. And they are unharmed. But as you might imagine, her dad and Martin's dad come down and are furious and are like, get out of here. This is not safe. And when Martin refuses, they try to get Coretta and the baby to leave, and she refused. And many people talk about Coretta Scott King being having a kind of force of steel, that she was not going to be moved. It is that steel, right, that then leads her. She is very much, as both of them would say, the family spokesperson on peace issues. The Kings had gone to Ghana in 1957 to see Kwame Nkrumah assume the leadership of an independent Ghana. She had begun to speak out on issues of peace and nuclear weapons, first in D.C. in 1961. She goes to Geneva in 1962 as part of a delegation from the Women's Strike for Peace. She joins the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And when Martin is awarded the Nobel Prize in 1964, she really sees this as both an honor, but a responsibility that they now both have to world peace, to anti-colonialism. And she will begin to push him increasingly that he needs to come out publicly against the war in Vietnam. Obviously, they were privately against the war, and she will begin speaking out in 1965. When a reporter asks King, well, did you educate your wife on these issues? He replies, no, she educated me. So as we all on this call know, the last campaign they are building when he is assassinated is the Poor People's Campaign. As she describes it, we were mobilizing a nation. And so when Martin is assassinated on April 4th, she carries forward. 4 days later, she goes to Memphis to lead the march that he was supposed to lead. And then on May 1st, she launches the Southern Caravan of the Poor People's Campaign from the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, laying out her own dream, where not some, but all of God's children have food, where not some, but all of God's children have decent housing, where not some, but all of God's children have a guaranteed annual income in keeping with the principles of liberty and grace. 2 weeks later, at the Mother's Day March of welfare recipients, she criticized the hypocrisy of America, where violence against poor people and minority groups is routine. She reminded the nation of its own acts of violence. Neglecting school children is violent. Punishing a mother and her family is violence. Ignoring medical needs is violence. Contempt for poverty is violence. For the next 35 years, she would continue to fight for a guaranteed annual income, for welfare rights, for gay rights, around AIDS activism, anti-apartheid work, opposition to both the first and second wars in Iraq. So centering Coretta Scott King in our memorialization today of the March on Washington, I think first forces us to see the host of women who organized, led, fundraised, and supported the movement, who have at times been marginalized in our books and in our public memory. For the longest time, she explained, way before I married Martin, I had believed that women should allow our essence and our presence to shine rather than letting ourselves be buried or shunted to the sidelines. It also reminds us of the deep and ongoing connections between the Black freedom struggle, the global struggle for human rights and anti-colonialism and peace, and the fight for economic justice. Moving our remembrances from the black and white photos on the wall to ones that continue to speak to the issues of our time. As Coretta Scott King would say, struggle is a never-ending process. Thank you.